Imagine standing on a Viking battlefield in the 9th century. Your shield wall is breaking, your men are falling. Then something shifts. A group of warriors near you begins to transform. Their eyes go cold and fixed on nothing. They start to foam at the mouth. They're shaking violently. Within seconds, they're charging towards certain death with no fear, no hesitation, no regard for their own bodies. They move like they're not human anymore. They move like they're something else entirely. For almost 200 years, historians thought they knew exactly what was happening. A drug, a single red and white mushroom that turned men into rage machines, a chemical that could be sprinkled into their food before battle and suddenly they became unstoppable. It was such a perfect story that nobody questioned it. Nobody dug deeper. It was repeated in textbooks and documentaries and fantasy novels and video games. Everyone knew the story. The red mushroom, the berserker rage, the Viking warrior who ate a magical toadstool and became a weapon. Then everything changed. Ancient DNA was pulled from bones. Modern toxicology reopened the case. And almost every single thing we thought we knew about berserkers was completely and utterly wrong. But here's the really shocking part. It's not just about the drug. It's about something far stranger, something that reveals a truth about these warriors that's been buried for 1,000 years. This is the story of how a guess from 1784 became accepted fact, how modern science tore it apart, what actually turned ordinary men into the most feared warriors in Europe, and why their bloodline is still walking through Norway today, hiding in plain sight. Let's start with what we actually know. The evidence is written in medieval texts, not stories, records. Between the 12th and 14th centuries, Icelandic historians wrote down sagas based on oral traditions that went back centuries earlier. These weren't invented tales. These were descriptions of something real, something specific. And what's remarkable is how consistent the descriptions are. Different authors, different centuries, different countries. They all describe the same exact thing. The sagas describe warriors who went into battle without armor, not because they had to, because they chose to. They describe men who were as strong as bears or wild bulls, who could kill a man with a single blow, who seemed immune to fire and iron. The sagas describe the grandfather of one protagonist who could transform into a berserker by nightfall and couldn't be approached by anyone in his own household. They describe warriors who would bite the rims of their shields before combat, who would howl like animals as they advanced toward the enemy lines. They describe specific symptoms that appeared over and over again: the shaking, the foaming at the mouth, the way their eyes seemed to focus on something no one else could see, the way they would fight through wounds that should have killed them, the way they would collapse afterward and be unable to function for days. These descriptions are too specific to be poetry, too consistent to be invention. Something real was happening. The Vikings themselves had a name for it, the word berserker. It comes from Old Norse, a compound word. The second part is clear. Serker means shirt or coat. The first part, bear, is debated. It might mean the warrior wore a bear skin, or it might mean the warrior wore nothing at all. Both interpretations appear in the sagas. Some berserkers were described in animal pelts, others were stripped to the waist, defying the cold, but both were berserkers. Both performed the same function. That function was specific. They were elite, deployed as personal guards to kings, used as shock troops in major raids. They were valuable, but they were also feared. The same texts that praise them as warriors describe them as dangerous to live near, prone to random attacks, dangerous to their own communities. Several sagas mention berserkers being hunted down and executed by regular farmers once they were no longer useful in war. This wasn't just a warrior class. This was something more complicated, something controlled, something that made people afraid even when the warrior wasn't in the transformed state. The interesting pattern is when they appeared in history. The berserker phenomenon is concentrated from roughly the 8th through the 11th centuries, densest in Norway and Sweden, but documented across the entire Viking world, from the British Isles to the Eastern European river systems. But then something happened. The Nordic countries converted to Christianity around the 11th and 12th centuries, and suddenly the berserker disappears from historical records. Completely. The later Icelandic law codes from this period, they explicitly outlawed the practice. Whatever system had produced berserkers was dismantled within a few generations. The figure moved from active warrior to legend, to myth, to history. This is where the real mystery begins. The descriptions were too detailed to be fiction, the symptoms too specific, the references too consistent across separate texts written by separate people at separate times. But for over 1,000 years, nobody knew what was actually causing it, what was putting men into this state. For nearly all of that 1,000 years, the answer was the same. It had to be a drug. What drug? That's what everyone wondered. The answer arrived in 1784. A Swedish theologian and natural historian named Samuel Odman published a paper. His theory was elegant and it made sense. The red and white mushroom, Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric. He said the berserkers were eating this mushroom before battle. The mushroom was known to shamans in Siberia. The cultural distance wasn't that great between Siberia and Scandinavia. Knowledge could have traveled along the same trade routes that connected the regions. He matched the effects of the mushroom to the saga descriptions. Dissociation, reduced pain sensitivity, agitation, they seemed to fit. The theory was visual, memorable, easy to picture, a red and white mushroom with a dramatic look, a warrior transformed by chemical magic. Here's the thing, though. Odman had never tested the mushroom on a human. He had never examined a single Viking skeleton. He had never analyzed any chemical residue from a Norse site. He made an educated guess based on literary comparison, and that guess became accepted fact. It appeared in encyclopedias, academic papers, popular histories, school textbooks, television documentaries. Every modern depiction of a Viking berserker, every fantasy warrior who eats a magical mushroom before going berserk, traces back to a single 18th century guess from a man who never tested his theory. For 200 years, this was the accepted answer because nothing better existed. The tools to actually test the theory didn't exist. There was no way to analyze ancient plant residue, no way to test skeletal remains for toxins, no way to know what Vikings actually ate or used. So Odman's elegant guess just sat there, getting repeated, getting cited, until it hardened into fact through sheer repetition. The mushroom story became so embedded in Viking mythology that questioning it felt like questioning the Vikings themselves. But then everything changed. Modern toxicology arrived. And someone finally asked the question that should have been asked in 1784. What does Amanita muscaria actually do to a human body? The answer was shocking. The active compounds in fly, agaric, are muscimol and ibotenic acid, powerful neurotoxins, and the effects they produce are well documented from centuries of medical case reports. The dominant symptoms are sedation, nausea, vomiting, profuse sweating, loss of muscle, coordination, confusion, slurred speech, in significant doses, unconsciousness. The mushroom is a depressant, it's not a stimulant. A man who had eaten enough fly agaric to alter his mental state would be more likely to vomit and fall asleep than to charge a fortified shield wall in the front ranks of a Viking army. The Siberian shamanic comparison fell apart too. When researchers actually examined the ethnographic records of indigenous Siberian mushroom use, they found something completely different from what Odman had imagined. The shamans who consumed the mushroom did so in stillness, often lying down in a tent while others watched them. They entered visionary trance states. They interpreted dreams. They communicated with spirits. They did not pick up weapons afterward and charge into battle. The cultural function of the mushroom was the exact opposite of what the berserker hypothesis required. By the early 2010s, researchers were actively looking elsewhere. What plant could actually produce the effects described in the sagas? What substance could create dramatic increased physical capacity, sustained coordinated combat performance, pain immunity? And then a distinctive symptom that appeared over and over in the saga descriptions, foaming at the mouth. What could create all of that? The answer emerged: black henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. The plant grows wild across northern Europe, including all throughout Scandinavia. It was known to Norse-era herbalists, but its active compounds, hyoscyamin and scopolamine, work in a completely different way than the mushroom. They belong to the tropane alkaloid family, the same family that produces the effects of belladonna and datra. And when you compile the clinical literature on henbane poisoning from modern toxicology cases, something incredible happens. The profile matches the saga descriptions almost perfectly, item by item. Henbane produces severe agitation, not sedation like the mushroom, agitation. It produces vivid hallucinations, often with violent or paranoid content. It produces dramatic dissociation from pain, which is one of the most consistent reported effects in poisoning cases. It produces tachycardia, dramatically elevated heart rate, and the flushed hot skin that comes with it. It produces a distinctive symptom that appears repeatedly in the saga descriptions of berserker behavior: foaming or frothing at the mouth, caused by the suppression of the body's normal swallow reflex. And in the recovery phase, it produces profound and prolonged exhaustion, the kind that can last for days, exactly matching what the sagas describe: the collapse after battle, the inability to function for extended periods. Where the mushroom produced sedation, henbane produced agitation. Where the mushroom produced nausea and stillness, henbane produced violent activity and pain immunity. Where the mushroom had no documented combat tradition anywhere in the world, henbane produced exactly the symptom profile that Norse warriors had been described as displaying for 1,000 years. The fit wasn't approximate, it was exact. But theory is one thing, evidence is another. Was there any actual proof that Vikings had used this plant? In 1977, Danish archaeologists were excavating a Viking-era cemetery at Firkat, a fortified stronghold built during the reign of King Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century. They opened a burial that was different from the others. The grave belonged to a woman, dated to roughly 980 AD. The goods buried with her marked her as someone of extraordinary status. She had been placed in a wagon body, a treatment reserved only for the highest-ranking individuals. She wore silver arm rings, ornaments unknown anywhere else in the Scandinavian record. She had been buried with a bronze bowl from Central Asia, a metal wand of the kind described in saga literature as an object carried by ritual specialists. And she had been buried with a set of objects that confused the excavators at first. Among them was a small leather pouch. Inside that pouch were several hundred seeds. When the seeds were sent for identification, the results came back. Black henbane, hyoscyamus, hundreds of seeds, deliberately collected, processed, stored in a sealed container, buried with a woman whose other grave goods marked her as a ritual practitioner. Researchers identified her as a vulva, a Norse ritual specialist described in ancient poetry as women who traveled between communities, women who performed ceremonies, who interpreted visions, who administered substances that altered the mental states of those who consumed them. She was a drug priestess, and she had been buried with hundreds of henbane seeds. But the Firkat burial wasn't the only find. Subsequent excavations across Scandinavia turned up henbane seeds in warrior burials, in ritual deposits, in high-status graves dating across the Viking Age. The plant was being grown, harvested, curated within Norse society, and the contexts where it appears in the archaeological record are consistently ritual rather than domestic. This wasn't a kitchen herb. This was a controlled substance handled by specialists, deployed for specific purposes. The forensic case strengthened when researchers examined specific sagas and matched them to the clinical symptoms. Eagle's saga describes a berserker named Liot entering a state where he howled and bit his shield and was then incapacitated for days afterward. The clinical literature on henbane recovery describes exactly this profile, the behavioral changes, the recovery period. The specificity was uncanny. The ritual context also explained something the mushroom theory never could. In the sagas, the berserker isn't described as a man who eats something on his own before a battle. He's part of an organized cohort, drawn from specific lineages, attached to specific kings, deployed in specific formations, subjected to initiation rituals that the texts describe but rarely explain in detail. The administration of a controlled and dangerous plant by trained ritual specialists fits this picture perfectly. A man eating a foraged mushroom doesn't. The berserker wasn't acting on personal initiative. He was the output of an institution. This is where the story becomes fascinating. The henbane was administered, the dose was controlled, the recovery was managed by specialists who knew how long the effects would last and how to care for the warrior as he came back down. The warrior who emerged from the experience wasn't acting alone. He was part of a system that had grown the plant, trained the specialist, prepared the ritual, and produced on demand a man capable of doing what ordinary men could not. That's not drug abuse. That's a military technology. The pharmacological question had been answered. But there was one more piece to the puzzle. The men themselves. For the entire modern era, berserkers had been treated as something separate from ordinary Norse society. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, scholars suggested they might be a distinct ethnic or tribal lineage, maybe descendants of an older population of northern Europe, maybe imported from somewhere else in the Viking trade networks. But in any case, they were biologically different, genetically distinct. The berserker was not just culturally different, he was genetically other. This theory was built exactly like Odman's mushroom hypothesis. In the absence of evidence, and like the mushroom hypothesis, it didn't survive the arrival of actual evidence. When ancient DNA analysis of Viking Age skeletal remains became possible in the 2010s, everything changed. An international team, led by researchers at the University of Copenhagen, sequenced the genomes of more than 400 individuals from Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia and the Viking diaspora, from Norway and Sweden to the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and the eastern river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The study overturned several assumptions about Norse genetic identity. The Vikings weren't a uniform Scandinavian population. The genetic record showed significant gene flow into Scandinavia from southern Europe, the British Isles, and the Asian steppes across the Viking Age. It was a heterogeneous society. Individuals of widely different ancestries lived, fought, and were buried alongside one another. Within this larger picture, researchers examined specific high-status warrior burials with greater resolution than had ever been possible. Skeletal remains identified through grave goods, burial position, and skeletal trauma patterns as belonging to elite warriors, including burials interpreted as berserkers, did not show the genetic signature that the older theories had predicted. They weren't outliers. They weren't concentrated in any unusual ancestry cluster. They didn't carry markers indicating descent from a separate population. They sat squarely within the mainstream genetic distributions of Viking Age Norway and Sweden, indistinguishable from the farmers, the fishermen, and the craftsmen buried in nearby graves. The implication was specific and profound. The Berserker wasn't a genetic outlier. He wasn't a foreign import or the descendant of a vanished tribe. He was a local man, drawn from the same population that worked the fjords and farmed the inland valleys. What set him apart from his neighbors wasn't his bloodline. It was the institution that had claimed him. The capacity for the berserker state wasn't in the genes. It was in the system that selected him, trained him, administered the henbane, and deployed him on command. This finding inverted the central question of berserker research. For over a century, people had asked who the berserker was descended from. But that was the wrong question. The interesting thing was never who he was descended from. The interesting thing was what had been done to him. The transformation that the sagas described wasn't the expression of an inherited trait. It was the output of a pharmacological and ritual pipeline that converted ordinary Norwegian men into a specific kind of weapon. The berserker in this reading wasn't a creature. He was a product of a system. The production line ran through specialists like the Firkat woman who grew the plant, prepared the dose, and administered it to men whose ancestors had farmed the same valleys for generations. When the Christianization of Scandinavia happened and the institution ended, the production line ended with it. The ritual specialists disappeared. The knowledge disappeared. The practice was explicitly outlawed. But the men themselves didn't end. Their genetic material didn't vanish. It went somewhere. And this is where the story reaches its most striking revelation. Population-scale genetic studies of present-day Scandinavians, drawing on tens of thousands of sequenced genomes from Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic biobanks, have established direct and traceable continuity between the Viking Age population and the modern Scandinavian one. The genetic distance between a 10th century Norwegian warrior and a 21st century Norwegian farmer is in most cases statistically negligible. The same Y chromosome haplogroups documented in Viking-era warrior burials, including burials interpreted as belonging to berserker cohorts, are present at high frequencies in modern Norwegian men today. Specific lineages traced through ancient DNA have been matched to living descendants in the same geographic regions where the original burials were excavated. The berserkers as genetic individuals didn't disappear with the Christianization of Scandinavia in the 11th century. The institution that produced them disappeared. The ritual specialists who controlled the henbane disappeared. The pharmacological pipeline was dismantled within a few generations. Icelandic law codes from the period explicitly outlawed going berserk. But the men themselves didn't vanish. They fathered children before the institution ended. Those children fathered children. The genetic chain has never been broken in the 1,000 years since the last documented berserker laid down his axe. Think about the contrast with how we remember them. In popular history, in fantasy literature, in film, and television, the berserker is treated as a vanished archetype, a creature of saga and legend, extinct with the end of the Viking Age. The figure has the narrative shape of the Anastasia of the American Southwest, or the Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean, a people whose disappearance is the central fact of the story. The DNA tells a completely different story. The disappearance never happened. What ended was not a population, it was a practice. Now, this distinction matters. This matters a lot. The persistence of berserker ancestry in modern Norway is not a claim that modern Norwegians carry some hereditary capacity for rage. It's not a claim that the descendants of berserkers are biologically different from their neighbors. The berserker state was a cultural and pharmacological phenomenon. It required the plant, the specialist, the ritual context, the social institution that organized all of those things. None of those things are encoded in DNA. What's encoded in DNA is ancestry. And ancestry is a record of who fathered whom, not of what they did for a living. The berserker bloodline is not a monster's bloodline. It's simply a Norwegian one. What the genetic evidence does show is that the berserker, as a category of person, was never separate from the broader Norwegian population in the first place. He was drawn from it, transformed by it, and reabsorbed into it when the institution that defined him was abolished. The men who survived the raids, who lived past the typical lifespan of a warrior in that role, settled into the same villages and farmed the same valleys as everyone else. They married. They had children. The genetic signal of their lineages flowed back into the population pool from which they had been recruited. The men buried at Firkat and the other sites where the henbane and the warrior remains have been found are, in genetic terms, the direct ancestors of the population that lives in modern Norway today. There is no separate berserker descent line that survived alongside the mainstream. There's only the mainstream itself, which absorbed them. The men simply stopped being berserkers and went home. And their descendants are still there in the same valleys, on the same farms, looking exactly like everyone else. So we're left with a different berserker than the one we thought we knew. Not a mutation, not a foreign elite, not a magical creature, a product, a controlled production of warfare conducted by an institution that we now understand in much finer detail than we ever could before. The warriors were local men, ordinary in their genetics. transformed by a specialist who administered a plant that she had grown and prepared and stored for exactly this purpose. The plant was henbane, not a mushroom. The transformation was physiological and chemical, not supernatural. The institution that produced the warriors was dismantled, and the warriors themselves went home and lived ordinary lives and had children who became the ancestors of modern Norway. The mushroom story that lasted for 200 years was wrong. It was a guess made without evidence. The real story is more complex and more interesting. It's a story about how societies weaponize their own people, how they transform ordinary men into tools, how they control that transformation with knowledge of chemistry and ritual, and how that knowledge can be lost completely and utterly, leaving only the men behind, living out ordinary lives, their extraordinary past reduced to legend. The shocking part isn't that there's a genetic connection between Viking Berserkers and modern Norway. The shocking part is what that connection reveals. It reveals that the Berserkers never really vanished at all. What vanished was the system that made them. The men stayed, the institution left, and 1,000 years later, the descendants of Viking warriors are walking through Norway completely unaware that their ancestors performed one of the most extreme acts of ritualized violence in human history, transformed by a drug administered by priestesses whose knowledge disappeared with Christianization. The real mystery of the Berserkers isn't solved by finding the drug or the genes. It's solved by understanding that the disappearance was never about the men at all. It was about the end of a system. The men didn't go anywhere. They simply stopped being berserkers and became farmers again. And their bloodline is still there, still ordinary, still Norwegian, completely indistinguishable from everyone else. That's the part of the story that's truly remarkable. Not the rage, not the transformation, but the fact that when the system ended, the men just went home.